Hey folks, we're at about 2 minutes before the hour. We're expecting a fairly large group, so I'm going to mute everybody. I will talk about kind of various, when to ask questions, etc. At the top of the hour. But if folks don't mind, just hold tight and we will get started here in just a second. Thanks so much. All right, so we are right at the top of the hour. I'm going to get started. Now. I fully anticipate that folks will be kind of coming in, and I know that some folks need to leave early. Just want to kind of go over a couple of things before we get started here. Number one, hi everybody. My name is Xander Karsten. I am a project manager here at Legal Server, for those of you who don't recognize my voice. And today, and I'm also going to just start my video so that folks can see me and see the beautiful backdrop of my apartment. We are going to be talking about guided navigation today, and it's going to be a little bit different than the way that we've been maybe talking about guided navigation in the past. What we're going to do is we're going to go through a couple of different scenarios that we've set up here on our demo 4 site. So we're going to kind of start off with something relatively simple, go through how it was actually built out, and then kind of layer in some complexity and continue to work together to kind of see how that works and how we would address those specific issues. Because of that, while we're going to do a little bit of context setting, this is not the sort of how guided navigation is going to change your life, how it's going to make you coffee in the morning. We've had a couple of those conversations and presentations in the past. I'm certainly happy to talk offline with anybody about the different implementations of guided navigation. This call is really going to be much more focused for our admins on how actually to implement guided navigation on their sites. There were also questions about whether or not this call was going to be recorded. It is being recorded. We may or may not use this particular recording as the sort of published video guide to guided navigation. That is happening, that is coming. And my hope and my plan is to have that up before the new year. Oftentimes, however, just recording a training and then throwing it up on the YouTube channel isn't actually super helpful. People learn differently when they are watching something on the YouTube channel rather than actually kind of watching it in real time. So I just wanted to kind of call out that, you'll see in the participants list, this is being recorded. It may not, however, be the recording that we end up publishing. The last thing that I did want to call out, please do feel free to chat any questions that folks may have. Right now, we're at about 41 people, so the ability to actually interactively ask questions may be a little limited. But I will definitely respond to chats. If I don't get a chance to respond to your chatted question on the call itself, I'll follow up with you outside of the call. Last, but certainly not least, people are going to have questions about guided navigation as you go to implement this on your own sites. feel free to direct those questions to support@legalserver.org. You are more than welcome to CC me, but that'll go out to obviously our entire team. And so as folks have kind of questions or run into issues, please just feel free to email us at support. I think the final and last sort of piece of this guided navigation is a tool that we're continuing to work on and to refine through a bunch of different grants and sort of non-grant channels. So, you're going to see a few things as we go through today or as you've been experimenting. A couple of things that come to mind, we haven't whitelisted all of the blocks in LegalServer to be available on guided navigation. Those are rolling in as we kind of identify the various needs. But just be aware that things are continuing to change, and it is a tool very much in refinement and continuing to be worked on. So with that, I guess that my very last thing is that I apologize for any background noise. They chose today to do construction on the apartment next door because that's just the way the week is going. All right. So with that, and as I mentioned, if folks do have questions, feel free to chat them out as they come up, and I will pause throughout the call to answer those questions, but you may just be easier to chat them out as they occur to you. I will just, though, pause and kind of answer a bunch of them as they come up. So I do want to kind of take just a second and kind of contextualize guided navigation just a little bit. So guided navigation is a way to present fields, blocks, set field values, do various actions, so it's such as generating a document or providing an API call within a case, within an outreach, based on the fulfillment of certain conditions. And we'll see in a second what that means and how we program in those conditions. For the moment, for those of you who are very familiar with LegalServer, people have made the analogy that branch logic is similar to guided navigation. I actually think of it as in the opposite way, that branch logic is almost a subset of kind of the same concept of guided navigation. A certain set of conditions are met, specific fields are displayed, for example, and that's an example of branch logic. Guided navigation can almost be seen as an umbrella under which that fits. We are going to kind of, hopefully make that abstract a little bit more real. The scenario that I've kind of, come up with and I've been working with. So for our legal aid agency, we've just added a new veterans team. And that veterans program is accepting all the, any case where somebody has identified as a veteran, where their percentage of poverty is at or under 125%. And we just want to make sure that in our intake, based on those criteria, the assigned program, the intake and the assigned program both are going to read veterans. So I'm going to click over onto the hybrid guided navigation intake here. For those of you who still have or remember your credentials to Demo 4, you can see this, you can pull this up on the Demo 4 site. My only request for those of you who are doing it is, please, if you're going to do this and if you're going to experiment on Demo 4, that's great. Just create something new so that I can continue to use this one. And yeah. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to and I've kind of just come up with a quick, down and dirty, very simple intake. But know that this could be more complicated, right? This could have all of your different, information, your address, your phone number, all those good things. I'm really just kind of cutting to the essentials here. So I have our name, I have whether or not this person is a veteran, and then our financial information, which I'm going to just say that there's no income in the household. I'm not going to worry about the rest of this. And then here at Set My Program, what this is doing, and we're going to actually see this a second time in just a second, what this is actually doing on the back end, which folks can't see, is it's setting the intake program to veterans, because then our disposition block is setting our assigned program to the same thing as the intake program. So for those of you who are familiar with the disposition block and assigned programs, there are some fields in Legal Server that work best within a block. Assigned program is one of them. So what I just did here, and again, we'll see this in a second, I just want to kind of show people what this is going to look like at the end. So what I've done is I've set the intake program to veterans based on the conditions that we outlined before. And then when I hit continue down here, my disposition is going to default to veteran. So I just want to kind of show folks, we oftentimes take a look at the front end of how this looks, of how people may interact with it at the end. I think it's really helpful to put it up at the beginning, to just say this is as simple as that, right? Folks are still interacting with the exact same processes and forms that they may be used to interacting with. The only difference is, and we're going to come back to Set My Program, and we're going to come here to our admin and edit my form. The difference here is that this dialog runner is pulling in a new dialog called Set My Program. So for those of you who are familiar with litigation, the litigations module, or the person module, or the phases, also known as services module, this will look somewhat familiar in that there's a block that's pulling in the create form or the auxiliary form for a different module. And again, for those of you who aren't as familiar, I really think about blocks like these that are actually pulling in from other parts of Legal Server. I think of each of those modules as different rooms in a house, and these blocks are what create the windows. So just as the litigations module is its own module and it's separate from cases, there's a block called Create a Litigation, and that allows you to pull in a specific litigation create process. It creates a window between cases and litigations so you can enter that information and see those together. That's what's happening here. So, guided navigation is its own separate module, it's its own separate tool. What this block is doing here is it's saying, of all of the different dialogues, and we've got a whole bunch of them here, of all the different dialogues, pull this one in. And this one I've called Set My Program. The other thing that you can see here, and this is only available for those folks who have the user permission, edit guided navigation checked as part of their user role. You can see this orange box that says edit this segment. If I were just a regular user, someone who didn't have that user permission checked, I would not see this orange box at the top. I wouldn't have this blue clickable link. I would actually just see nothing, because what's happening in the background is that field is being set. Similarly, if I come into admin and I type in guided navigation into here, if I didn't have that edit guided navigation user permission checked, I would not be able to see this. I wouldn't see it at all. I might even think that guided navigation wasn't enabled on my site. Guided navigation is enabled on your site. If you can't see it, if you don't find it, just take a second, go to user, come up to actions, go to edit user roles or permission, take a look at administrator or whichever user role works for you. I always do Control F because I think it's the easiest, and you can see edit guided navigation. So if you're looking at your site now and you're not seeing the ability to see or find guided navigation, check your user permissions. It's probably there. I'm going to come back to add, and if it's not, if you've checked, please feel free to email support. And when you do that, please include the URL of the user role where you say, hey, I can see guided navigation is checked here. I still can't find it. Please include a URL. We love URLs. So I'm actually going to come into my guided navigation module here, my tool here. And you'll see we have two different types of dialogues. One's called interactive, one is called navigation. We will talk about the difference between these at a later point in this training. For right now, we are just going to focus on interactive dialogues. It is a helpful but probably a simplistic analogy to make in Legal Server, but it helps me. So for me, I think of dialogues as processes. I say that because if I come in, I'm going to use housing questions as an example. Each of our dialogues are made up of one or more segments. So you'll remember back here, it said, you know, this segment is called program, and I can edit this segment. Those segments are grouped together into dialogues, and it's actually on each of these segments that we see the different elements. I chose this one in particular because it had more than one segment here, but just like processes, where you can have one or more form in a process, you can have one or more segment in a dialogue. And then just like forms, segments have the various elements that people are actually interacting with. I'm going to come back out to my set program, and I'm going to edit this so that we can see what that segment looks like. So at the top, we have the dialogue name. This is, again, when we were setting up that dialogue runner, we used this dialogue name. We pulled this dialogue in called Set My Program. Set My Program is actually only has one segment in it because it was a pretty simple thing to do. So this is the only segment, and the segment is called Program. And this segment actually only has one element. I'm going to expand this, and we are going to, let's see. My apologies. I just did not wait for long enough. We are going to add additional. Elements into this form, and we're going to build a couple of these out on the call here together. But just wanted to kind of show you an initial setup. So we'll get back up to the logic in a second. I want to start actually here with element type. So we have our different elements that include all of your, old-time favorites. We've got our headers, our instructions, our fields, our blocks. We also have a bunch of extras down here where you can default values for a block. You can generate a document, and this is actually one that we're going to see because we can't go through all of these, but generate a document is pretty cool that I wanted to kind of show folks. Add a case note, perform an API call. In this case, we're setting a fields value. And when we select that, we get we can run the action. So the action, again, is setting the fields value, either when the segment is first shown or when the segment is submitted. So maybe, you may have some actions. You may want to set a fields value after a whole bunch of other things have happened in that segment. So you would want to change that to when the segment is submitted. For right now, it's fine for us to just do it when it's shown. And then again, because in our scenario, we have this new program and we want that intake program to default to veteran, I just selected intake program just by typing in intake program and set the value to veteran. We've got a couple of different options here: veteran, contract, general, and pro bono. I want that to set to veteran. So this all kind of, seems somewhat familiar, and you can kind of see how you would do that outside of guided navigation. It's really up here with the expressions editor, which is what we call this up at the top. that the power of guided navigation really lives. So you can either have those actions occur, have that field visible, have those headlines or instructions, whatever those. You can have them all the time by clicking on Always True, or you can select to use an expression. And we'll see this when we go and add another expression later in the process. But if I click on Use an Expression, I can set up one or more conditions which need to be met in order for that field to be visible, the block to be visible, the action to happen. So in this case, I picked veteran, which is our Boolean, just yes, no, that we saw in the very beginning of the intake. That has to equal yes. I have other options here though. I could say it doesn't matter if it's yes or no. I could say, that it's null or that it's simply answered, regardless of what the answer is. I'm also saying that one of that the percentage of poverty needs to be less or equal to 125%. Now, for those of you who are listening to me at the very beginning, and when I started talking about percentage of poverty, you were thinking in the back of your mind, well, yes, Xander, but you didn't say whether it was the initial percentage of poverty or the adjusted percentage of poverty. We have you covered. So this is saying the percentage of poverty is less than or equal to 125%, or up here, adjusted percentage of poverty is between 1 and 125%. So because oftentimes if the percentage of poverty is under 125%, the adjusted percentage of poverty is actually 0 because there's no adjustment needed. You can't just say that adjusted percentage of poverty is less than or equal to 125%. You need to give that range. And that's just sort of a wrinkle, quite honestly, that I found yesterday when I was setting this up. But what's important here, and so that just goes to kind of, say if you can't, for me, it took a little bit of futzing to figure out exactly what the right rule is. Once you enter a rule, that the system will implement that rule as it's written rather than necessarily as you intended it. So I found that when I was doing this before, just that between worked well for this in particular. But you can see that the important thing here, though, is that these are grouped together. One of these two conditions need to be met, and they're joined with an or. Once one of these conditions are met and veteran equals yes, that's when we're setting this field. I picked a relatively simple example because you can see really quickly how this can be a truly super robust tool, and one that you can just do a lot of different conditions with. Again, not just to set a value, but to show a field or to show a block. If I wanted to make it even more complicated, which I don't, I can add a rule down here. I can delete out those rules. I can combine these with ands or ors, obviously. A couple of things that I do want to show. I'm going to just show for intake date, because these different filtering criterias are different based on the field type. So we've got things that are, for intake date, we have a date that's equal to or not equal to, is in or not in, is less than, is greater than, is between. And you can get two dates here. Days before, days after. Again, is null, is not null. So a lot of these are ones that you will, different filters that will look similar to the filters that you may also see in reports. For me, it's always helpful to kind of relate these different tools to other tools in Legal Server. If that's not helpful for you, feel free to ignore it. But these are similar to the different these are similar to the different filters and filter types you'll have in reports. If I wanted to do something like, we're going to talk more, we're going to do more with problem code in a second, but if we wanted to base this on legal problem code, we have, again, is not, is empty, is not empty. And then for lookups, we can choose as many of these as we want to trigger. And if any of these are the cases problem code, those would trigger. The other one that is helpful is, so we have, so for open text fields even, you can do different conditions based on the content in the open text field. So is equal, is not equal, begins with, ends with, contains, generally is the most helpful one for open text fields. So if there's a specific word or set of words that are contained within a text field, that can be, you can specify what those are as well. All right. Sorry, I was just checking the chatter over in, so there was a question about the output expression. We are actually going to hold on output expressions because we'll talk about that in just a second, but we're not going to set an output expression on this yet because I actually want to make this a little bit more complicated in just a second. However, it is important to say for output expression, for default destinations. So output expressions, and again, we'll talk about this in a second, is also uses the expressions editor to tell what happens next. I'm on this segment, what segment do I go to next? Within this dialogue or maybe even within another dialogue. We'll get more into that in just a bit. However, for every segment, no matter how many output expressions you have, does not matter, you have to specify a default destination. This is always going to be required. You have two options. You can either exit the dialogue completely, which is what's happening here, or you can choose a segment either in this dialogue or in another dialogue, and you go to a segment. So we'll see this in a second, where you may have a 2-step or 3-step or 5-step dialogue where you just want that to flow naturally, or you want based on certain outputs that to jump around, and then in other situations you want that to flow in a specific way. When you are mapping out, especially for super complicated guided navigation questionnaires, where you are, I always suggest that people map them out, and there's kind of a couple cool tools that we'll see at the end that will show you sort of how that maps out. I always suggest people just sit with a pen and paper and just map out where you want things to go, and figure out, kind of where your defaults are going to be, because you always need a default destination. It won't let you save if you don't have that. So this is what's happening when we hit this page on this segment. If I wanted the intake program to display, because this action for set the field's value isn't going to display the field that's being set, I could just change this to field to capture. I could do intake program. I could also set a default. I mean, this is doing essentially the same work. Even if I wanted to make this read only, I could do that. I'm not going to save it this way because I like it using the action, but this sort of setup, which folks would be familiar with, you can do that, currently just on a form, obviously without the conditions being present, but where we have that field to populate, defaulting the value, making it read only. This would show me read only veterans when those criteria were met. So I'm going to come back to, I'm actually going not to say, I don't want to save any of that. I'm going to come back to this, and our sort of the next The next piece of the scenario that I've sort of been thinking up, so we've got this veterans program. So far, it's just been taking everything that is where folks are a veteran, percentage of poverty or adjusted percentage of poverty is 125 or less. And now we're going to add in the fact that they're really interested in housing issues, and it's just going to be housing issues. And so they've got a set of questions that they want to ask for their various housing folks. And then for everybody who identifies as having an issue with service, so being served their eviction papers, they want to print out a specific letter that has information on service. So that's sort of that's what we're looking to do. So coming back into just my guided navigation, we have a couple of things that are set up, and I've set these up under housing questions. So I'm going to just start with the segment called Housing Questions, and we're going to kind of just look at this. What this is asking for is a type of housing question. And then if that type, if people are selecting evictions or foreclosures, it's going to ask, have you been served with eviction papers? Again, if somebody responds evictions or foreclosures, it's going to ask for the monthly rent or mortgage. If somebody says other, it's going to ask, do you have issues with your landlord? And then we have this output expression. If you've been served with eviction papers and that equals yes, it's then going to show the dialog called eviction information. So the idea behind here is in our last example, that field was set just based on information that was entered elsewhere in the case, in this case, an intake process. There was nothing on the page in the segment that was triggering anything else. It was information that had already been entered on the case. For this, we're actually going to take information that's being entered right there and display different questions, do different actions based on the responses. And I just want to show folks, for this output expression, this have you been served with eviction papers equals yes, then we're going to go to this dialog, and again, the segment is called eviction information. Otherwise, we're going to exit the dialog completely. Again, just like we saw with the different expressions that we see up here, it's the same expressions editor. I can add different rules. I can add groups of rules. I can, again, combine them with ands and ors. There's lots of ways that we can route those different next steps on coming from each of these segments. One thing that I just want to kind of point out, these output expressions, they only apply to the segment that I'm on. So this is only telling me when I hit housing questions, where do I go next? And then for our eviction information on that segment, it would have its own set of output expressions. Where do I go from there? So each of these is just where do I go from each segment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back up. I'm going to come back out into my guided navigation, and I'm actually going to come to set my program. I'm going to edit my program, and I'm going to add the element for, I'm going to do the block for problem code. And it would be great if I could spell while being watched by many people. And actually what I'm going to do, one thing that I do want to point out, See when I hit problem code and it says outreach up here, and I didn't even think about it, I just selected it. This is actually going to give me an error because this is trying to pull in the block for outreach's problem code. What I want is my primary intake initial information problem code. And I don't need special problem code for this. I just want my problem code. I'm going to say that this is always going to be true for this particular situation. Again, I always want to ask in this scenario what the legal problem code is. I could, again, use an expression, and that's how I would trigger that expressions editor. But for right now, I want that always to be true. And I am going to add my output expression. So where the legal problem code is going to be 63. And then I'm also going to add a new rule where the intake program is veteran. Then I'm actually going to hop out of this dialog. I'm going to hop into the housing questions dialog. And I'm going to start with my housing questions. Otherwise, I'm just going to exit the dialog. So that's successfully saved. I get this little green saved dialog successfully. And so I hope that everything has saved correctly, and I'm just refreshing. So I'm going to do 63, private landlord tenant. Now I do have a couple of boxes down here. I do have my next box. I do have a start over, which is going to restart my guided navigation dialog. I can also skip the dialog and continue, which is going to take me right into my disposition page. Right now, all of the different calling of the dialogues, going between dialogues, those are all happening within the block. If I want to get out of this page and move on, I can skip the dialogue. There are a couple of just sort of notes. You can, some of these you can control within the block, and we'll see that in just a minute. Some of them, though, are just going to be there. So if I hit next, and hopefully everything is set up correctly, now I have my segment housing questions. And again, I can come in and edit the segment. Here, I can pick eviction, and it's going to trigger, have I been served with eviction papers? And it's going to ask me for my rent. If I select foreclosure, the same thing is going to happen. But if I say other, I'm going to have, do you have issues with your landlord? So again, when people say, oh, that works exactly like branch logic, this very specific use case is what they're really talking about, but you can see how much more expansive guided navigation is. So I'm going to say yes, I have been served with eviction papers, and I'm going to hit next. And then what I have here, and I'm going to come in so folks can see, what I have here is download a generated document. The reason for that is when back in our outreach expression, we said where eviction paper, where being served with eviction papers equaled yes, go to eviction information. This eviction information segment has just my one generated document. Again, I can generate that document when I use a specific, either based on a specific set of criteria, a specific expression. I can again either run the action when the segment is shown or when it's submitted. And then this is showing me all of my different document templates. And I can either show the document, the link to the document after it's generated, or I can just generate the document. It's going to save to the cases generated document folder. It's just not going to have the downloadable link. And this is Xander's test. I did actually, so if I click on download generated document, it's going to download. I'm going to reshare my entire desktop for just a second. When I open this up, it has, I did a document template. So we've got Dear Test Test. From our conversation, you've received an eviction notice. There are several different types of notices that landlords can serve to tenants. That would be whatever information you would want that to be. Actually going to now just reset my share to only this page. And so that's our download generated document. I have a couple of options. I've now come to the end of the options in my guided navigation dialog. I know that I can come here and start over. I can hit previous, but there is no next. So I know here that, you know, I'm done, and I can hit continue at this point. And now my disposition page shows up as I'd expect, because I'm now out of that dialog runner into my regular intake. Conceptually, you can create an entire intake that's just in, that's literally just in guided navigation. So you could have, you know, your intake just be different segments of a specific, I'm sorry, I got distracted by the chat message. You can, you know, you can have your entire intake all in one dialogue, just with different segments that help to kind of move around or jump around. Many of you have heard the sort of test and the pilot program for this was Cleveland, who had really, really complicated questionnaires that involved moving from questionnaire to questionnaire, looping back based on different criteria. So, you know, when you think about, you know, moving from one guided navigation dialog to another, kind of a perfect use case of that, for those of you who do any bankruptcy or foreclosure work, you know how tightly those two things can be tied. It may make sense in the middle of a foreclosure to be like, we actually, based on these criteria, we need to switch into the bankruptcy questionnaire, or vice versa. So just some kind of thoughts on that. There was a question about whether the start over or these buttons down here are customizable. So if I come into my admin and again, my edit form, you can show the start over button. You can show the skip button. That skip button, if you want to skip the dialogue in its entirety, you can change that label. Currently, there's not going to be a way to change the label for the start over button, and there is no way to disable the previous button. So just be aware of that. There's always going to be a way for a user to get back to the page they were just on. In this case, to the segment that they were just on. So just being aware of that. I want to take a quick moment and talk a little bit about the differences between our navigation dialogue and our interactive dialogues. And then we're going to talk about just some cool features on that will help you guys to sort of troubleshoot and to see other things here in guided nav. So I'm going to come back to my guided navigation. And again, I just want to kind of give folks the visual for the interactive dialogues, which have these segments that have both elements that you see and you can fill out and you can interact with, hence interactive dialogue, as well as the output expressions at the bottom. Navigation dialogues are different because they only have output expressions. This is really used for routing. The quintessential example is, especially if you're in an intake, you get to that case questions part, and instead of having the case questions as the block that we have now, you want to trigger based on the legal problem code. You want to trigger the various correct dialogue. One way that you can do that is to have a navigation dialogue where you hook up all the different interactive dialogues to this one based on legal problem code or whatever other conditions you want. This is really just for routing. You can achieve a lot of what is here just within the interactive dialogue. But if you just want an easy, almost thinking of it as a hub, that kind of gets you to those different interactive dialogues, this can be really what you're looking for. It's one of those things, you kind of know it when you see it. And certainly if you have questions about should I be using, a navigation dialogue versus an interactive dialogue, feel free to email support and we can kind of talk you through the pros and cons of each. I generally tend to err on the side of using interactive dialogues, just basically because you can, for most guided navigation, it is not super complicated, and you can trigger the various fields to display based on whatever conditions you need or you want. So there were a couple of other things that I just wanted to show in, and I'm going to take the housing questions just as an example. There are a couple of things that I just wanted to kind of show that were other tools that don't quite fit, as cleanly into our example. You can view any of these dialogues as a questionnaire. So if you just want to see, what's happening at a bird's eye view of what's actually going on. So for example, we are collecting the field type of housing, and this is just showing you when that field is going to be displayed. So we're collecting the field, have you been served with eviction papers? And that's only going to display when housing type issue is eviction or foreclosure. You can also see down here the output expressions themselves. The eviction information here is just pulling, when when it renders the page, it's going to show the link to that is true. These both also show the default destination and gives you a quick link to edit that segment. You may not need that quick link when you're talking about 2 segments, but when you're talking about 30 segments, it can be really, really helpful. Go back to my editor. The other thing that I find to be very useful is this visualize. And again, this is, this always is fun on my Mac, where you can see the segment of housing. So this is our first segment. And then again, have you been served with eviction papers? This is that question. And then the segment displays as eviction information. Again, is, not, when we've only got 2, seems pretty straightforward and pretty simple, but again, can really be helpful when you have, 10 or 20 different segments to kind of see visually if you're that kind of learner. It's also really, really helpful as you're reviewing things. If you have a segment that's not connected to anything and you don't realize that, this is the visualization that will help you to do it. So I oftentimes will use it rather than, actually saying, okay, like clicking on all those little kind of arrows to see how things were connected. It actually can give you a good bird's eye view of anything that may not be connected, or anything that you think, is should be connected by 20 different steps, but you see is only connected by 1, for example. On each of these different segments, you also have the, I'm actually going to do this one. You also have a very quick preview. This is going to show you what the fields, what's actually happening on that segment are. One output expression is going to be defined here. So for here, I had my default destination, and then if eviction papers were served equals yes, then you head into eviction information. You will notice throughout all of guided navigation, you can delete things. So you can hit delete. It's going to ask you, are you sure you want to remove this item? I'm going to say, no, I am not sure. Please know though, guys, once it's deleted, it's deleted. So just, be aware of that. Down here is where I would go ahead and add a new segment to this dialogue. So if there was yet another thing I wanted to be able to do, I could add it here. And this up here is going to give me a default entry point. So for many, so when you're moving in between different segments, you can specify which dialogue you're entering and at what point. So you may have, going back to the foreclosure and bankruptcy example, you may have a set of questions that are asked that are basically the same that are asked in both of those questionnaires. You just want to enter that bankruptcy questionnaire from foreclosure midway through. You can specify that, but this is going to be your default. When you add it to the dialogue runner, when I'm adding it here, and I say dialogue to run, where do you want it to start? And that's what that's going to show. Coming in to my housing questions, we have that same view as questionnaire, visualize the segment. So this is probably, for those of you who admin regularly, this is one of the, I go through the entire guided navigation with all of the different conditional logics, which I think are just amazing and really really incredible. This is the one that actually gets the most oohs and ahs. If I click on create field, I can actually create a field right here from the guided navigation editor itself. I can choose the type of field that I am creating. So I've got all my usual Boolean, date, number, percentage, text area. I can also select a lookup or an existing custom lookup, or I can create a new custom lookup right here, which is actually going to ask me my name for the lookup values. I can add more values, and then I can call it right into the field that I'm creating. So just something to do that. The field is being created on the Matter module currently. There's not going to be a way to create it on a different module. It's also being assigned the group of guided navigation so that you can easily see which fields are being created as part of the guided navigation process as opposed to elsewhere in your system. The other thing that I also wanted to just show quickly, and I'm going to come into a case. Once I've done a guided navigation, I've run a dialogue on a case, I can actually, obviously the fields will be filled in, so you can add those fields to the profile or to an auxiliary process, whatever works for you. You can also view dialogue summaries. And this I was playing with, and I know actually what happened. But it's going to show a list of all of the dialogues that were run, as well as a summary of what happened in each. What's particularly helpful in those views is that it will show you why the different logic was triggered for that specific case. So that is working on folks' sites now. It is it's a static action. So if I come to admin and I come to edit my profile, just show folks because it can be a little hard to add to your menu. So when you're kind of playing around with this on demo, just coming into the menu box, put it under actions. View dialogue summary is actually just a static action. So you don't have to create anything new to get that view on. This is a view that's still very much in refinement. So, that's not, what you're looking at now is likely not going to be the view that you'll see in 3 to 6 months. So just wanted to call that out, but it can be really helpful. Currently, so there was a question earlier about whether this was available on outreaches as well. Currently, the dialogue runner, I believe, is only available on the cases, and matters. So it's currently not available on outreaches. So just be aware of that. There was also a really good point that Jeff made in chat, that if you do already have a field that is going to do what you want it to do, please reuse the field that already exists and do not create a new one. It's always great to be able to, create new fields easily, but oftentimes it can lead to a lot of confusion, especially if they're named exactly the same thing. So I think that the dialogue runner also is not available on time slips. That I'm less sure about what that would look like, but currently it's just on the cases and the matters. So I think everything in chat has been answered. We're about 6 minutes to the top of the hour. So if folks do have other questions, feel free to chat them out. Again, we will have a recording. It may not be this recording, but we will have a recording up in the next couple of weeks. And I think that, yeah, so hopefully this was helpful. Also, if you found this, if you found this training particularly helpful, this is the first time that I've done it starting with an example rather than kind of talking more conceptually about guided navigation. There's a question to go through this from the user's end again, and we can do that in just a second. But this is, again, sort of just, this is the first time I've done it with kind of just starting with a concrete example and working the way through. If you have any feedback, feel free to honestly just send it to Jeff, because he will give me the news in a nice and polite way. So coming in from the user's perspective again, and this intake can be built out as much or as little as you want. But I've just got my test. I've got my veterans equals yes. Got some very basic financial information that I'm just going to set to no income because it's easy. And all of that is your regular old intake. It is not until this point that we hit any sort of guided navigation. Again, this segment program, this is not going to be visible for folks who are just regular users in your system. But what has happened here is that it has set the intake program to veterans. So that has happened behind the scenes. From the front, all you're going to see is the legal problem code. If I say 63, private landlord tenant, which is what we've set this up, because again, it's veterans cases that are facing a private landlord eviction. I'm going to hit next. It's going to then pull up the different type. They're asking for the different types of housing. I'm going to say that this was an eviction, and I have indeed been served with eviction papers, and I pay rent of $450 a month. I hit next. It's going to give me that document that we talked about. Again, one of the requirements for this program is that they provide a letter with service information for anyone who's been served with eviction papers. I could download this here. I've already downloaded it once, but I could download this here. It is being saved to the case. I'm now done with my guided navigation. So that dialogue has come to its natural end. I'm going to hit continue, and it's going to take me out onto my disposition page. And I see my assigned program is veteran. Again, in my disposition block, I had set my assigned program to default to the intake program. So functionally, when I set my intake program, it set my assigned program. And when I hit continue, I should, with any luck, come to my case profile. And then if I come down, we can see my the generated document that I just that they just generated. So that's part of my case. All right. So thanks for everybody who held on for the last few minutes. We've got about 2 minutes left. I will keep the meeting open for anyone who is, maybe pondering or just a slow typer. And feel free to chat out anything. I am going to end right at the hour, however. Please feel free, shoot me an email, shoot support@legalserver.org an email. It will get to me. Currently, Ron and I are both kind of, fielding the various guided navigation questions. So feel free to email those, especially as you start to play with it. It's a really great tool. So thank you so much, and I hope everybody has a good holiday. And yeah, have a good one all.